cooperating. Okay,
I
there
never
it
have
is.
any problem with it.
Click. And we're live. It is Wednesday, March 24th, 2021, 5 o'clock p.m. And I got vaccinated today, only a few weeks behind Kate. The DC vaccination system in the pouring rain worked like a charm.
It looks sunny there now.
It is not sunny. It is overcast and drizzling. Oh. But this morning it was pouring, drenching rain. And the folks at Howard University Hospital could not have been more efficient in getting people through in a pleasant way. So I guess it's 1.5 cheers for the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. Darrell, are you vaccinated yet?
I am, and I just want to warn you, I had no side effects from the first shot. The second shot packs more of a whammy. Like the first 6 hours, I was okay, but after that, there was fever, chills, and fatigue for one day. And then after that, it was perfectly okay. So
Moderna?
Watch it tomorrow.
Moderna or Pfizer, Darrell?
Mine was Moderna.
Yes.
I had the opposite with Pfizer. I had really bad side effects the first shot and nothing the second time. But I've heard that about Moderna.
Anyway, I just want to say this is the beginning of being allowed to have fun again. So we may have to change the slogan of the show at some point, but as long as we can still say it, we will. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we are allowed to have a conversation with Daryl West, who has a distinction among guests of this show. He is the only guest on the show ever to be in a significant position of authority over both hosts. Daryl is correct.
Actually, I would question both of those assumptions.
Darrell,
no one owns you, Ben.
in his current life as vice president of governance studies at Brookings, he is my colleague and actually my boss. And in his past life as the director of the Taubman Center at Brown University, where a young Kate Klonick was coming up through the system, Kate called me aghast and just shocked the other day. How did you get Daryl West on the show? He's a legend.
And Kate, it was very simple. I was asking questions about video streaming, and he said, "Hey, come on, and you can see how it operates." So it was a
exactly.
deal.
So that's the answer. It's Daryl, welcome to In Lieu of Fun.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be on both with you, Ben, and Kate. It's great to get reacquainted with you. Kate has done amazing things in the 15 years since she left Brown.
Oh, God, 15 years. Jeez.
So, Darrell, you are, among other things, one of the most diverse scholars at Brookings, which I was, in thinking about today's show, I was looking over just the range of stuff that you've done over the years. And I jokingly wrote in the description of today's show that your books range from, political advertising to AI policy to billionaires. And that's actually, it was sort of, I said it flippantly, but it's actually quite literally true. And so I wanted to start with the question of whether there is a through line that connects everything you do, or whether you're just, have a real diversity of interests that are basically not connected to one another.
Actually, that's a great question. And there actually is a through line, although it's probably not apparent just from reading a list of publications. So I started out many years ago as a campaigns and election person. So very much interested in American politics. This is many years ago. And then as campaigns and elections became more media oriented, I kind of moved into media and politics. And then 20 years ago, technology started to intrude both on campaigns and elections as well as mass media. So for the last 20 years, many of my publications have focused on digital technology, its impact, not just on politics, but on society and the world at large. So for me, there was a very logical transition kind of across the set of topics. But I love learning about different things. And so writing books for me is an exercise in learning. And it's really fun to kind of go through the process of being interested in a topic, knowing a little bit, but maybe not too much. And then during the course of writing, learning a lot. And then at the end of the process, having a real sense of accomplishment that you have learned something about a particular topic.
I was going to ask about specifically, I ended up when it was ended up being my note when I was in law school. But I wrote a piece that was about e-governance and netroots activism, and basically trying to use some of the techniques that you talk about in some of your e-government work to create a better land use procedure for eminent domain, specifically in very in areas like New York, which are dominated by developer interests and very unhappy kind of individuals and holdouts. And so I'm really curious, not to kind of jump right into it, but I'm curious, I feel like that was, and I wrote that in 2009. And so your paper, I think that I cited to was in 2004. But I feel like e-government has gone the way of e-commerce. There is no e anymore. It's just commerce. It's just Amazon. It's not Amazon.com. What are do you think that do you think that that the fact that we both we're kind of drawn to that and it's turned into what it's turned into, do you think that it's fallen away as a concept?
It has fallen away as a concept. And this is actually my first entree into doing technology 20 years ago, because I noticed that government agencies were starting to do these things called websites, just as the internet was developing, and they were putting reports online. And then eventually there were some services, but they were very rudimentary. So our very first project was ranking federal government agency websites and state government websites on a variety of different dimensions. We put out our first report, and I was completely shocked. We had something 50,000 downloads. I mean, it was just huge interest. It was one of the kind of first systematic technology policy studies. And so I had intended that just to be a one-off project, and I was going to kind of go back to American politics. But when I saw the extraordinary interest in that topic, it showed me there was interest there that, and then when I looked around, there weren't a lot of people really studying technology policy at that time. And so then I just started to do more tech-related things. And as you know, over the last 20 years, there's just been an explosion of technology in every part of our lives, every part of the world. Every sector has been transformed by this. So you're right. We're now at the point where we can actually drop the E, because all of these sectors are now being digitized. And as your writing has pointed out, raises a lot of legal issues, policy issues, and regulatory issues. So it's really been fascinating just to kind of look at it historically as well as in the contemporary situation.
Yeah, so if Tomas Ilves were here, as he normally is, but unfortunately not today, he would, I think, pound his fist on the table and say, no, we dropped e-government in the United States because people lost interest in it, and a lot of it was too hard. And actually, if you go to a country like, say, Estonia, where they took e-government really, really seriously, there are all kinds of interactions that we do in person, or that we do in a cumbersome way that they do electronically with ease. And so my question, I guess, to you both, but is the premise of Kate's question wrong, that we got so far with e-government and then kind of dropped the E, but we actually had a very unambitious vision of it. And so there's all kinds of things that actually we're still doing in person. We're still doing by phone. We're still doing, because we didn't resolve some of the very basic digital identity questions that people like Tomas were saying, 15 years ago, if you can resolve this, you can actually do government online.
Well, maybe I'll let Kate take the first shot at that, since it was your original question.
Well, yeah. Thanks. So Tomas has talked about this a bit. He's always made it an exception for Estonia because of the scale of like Estonia, and the reason they were able to, and I think he's acknowledged that the reason that Estonia has been able to be so progressive with the use of technology in their government is because of scale. And I'll tell you how that relates to government, which I don't think it's like a very kind of, I guess, semi-cynical, semi-realist way, but I think that there is an element in which we do not want to make it easier, so to speak, to file like private claims in court, or to get certain types of documents. There are frictions and transaction costs in some of those things that preserve our privacy, that preserve. I mean, I actually just had my students do a chain of title search on a property using the Cook County property search records, which are free and open online, and you can search by name, which you can't do it for all of these records. They're all different, but like I give them this name, and they go back, and if they go back far enough, they find out that this was actually owned by Michelle and Barack Obama, and like, you know, and they can trace, and they can see all of the mortgages that the Obamas had, and who they had, who all their lenders were, and there is a problem in privacy if you make all of that completely transparent and free. And I think that at scale, if you kind of had created some of that, I think that that's what people started to see. Maybe that's cynical of me, but I think that's, I don't know, that's kind of how I came down. Like, notice and comment. People would have open text boxes, and they would just write these tomes in these open text boxes. But if they had to like go and file them, they might have, I mean, having read a lot of pro se claims in my day, I would say that sometimes maybe people would have still filed them, but like fewer people do. And so there's less.
What do you think, Darrell?
I mean, saying that we should drop the E does not mean that the technology revolution is over. I mean, I agree with the basic point that we actually are still relatively early in the technology revolution, but I think people are going to be shocked just over the next 5 to 10 years how we accelerate the types of digital innovations that are going to take place. I mean, just look at the COVID impact. I mean, we pushed what otherwise might have been 5 years of digital change into 5 weeks or 5 months, because we shifted to online learning, telemedicine, e-commerce, remote work, and a bunch of other things. And those are going to be permanent features of the landscape. Like, at best, organizations are going to have a hybrid model that's, you know, half in person and half digital. But there isn't just one technology revolution taking place now. There are like 10, 15, 20, or 50. They're just changes in AI, in robotics, quantum computing, supercomputing is coming online, 5G networks. When you add all this together, the pace and scale of innovation is going to skyrocket in the very near future. And what it means is those of us who are studying the policy, the laws, and the regulatory aspects of technology, like, we need to resolve these questions now, because 5 years from now, the innovation will have advanced to the point where it's going to be too late. So we need to kind of figure out privacy, cybersecurity, and all these other issues.
All right.
So I have a follow-up. I really want to ask both of you this, because Molly Brady and I debate this all the time, because she's been on the show. She's a friend of mine. She teaches property law at Harvard, and she is just like this, like, she loves being in like the land. She just like going through like the records office, and like, she like is just kind of an old-fashioned scholar, so to speak. And she gets really upset when I talk to her about tech disruption. She's like, there is no such thing as tech disruption. Everything is tech until it normalizes, and then it's just not tech anymore. And to like point that, she's like, people used to think of cars as tech. People used to think of indoor plumbing as tech, and then it becomes ubiquitous and everywhere, and all of a sudden it's not tech anymore. And so, and she's like, and everything is disruptive. Like, that's the other thing that she basically says, like, all new things are disruptive. It doesn't have to, like, and everything is technology. Okay, so maybe she's right. We go back and forth on this all the time. But I'm interested if you guys agree with that.
She's clearly wrong. And let me give you...
You can quote that on that.
Let me give you an example. So I have been, as Darrell knows, and actually as viewers of In Lieu of Fun knows, working on a project about the Attorney Generalship of Edward Levy. for the last bunch of time. And I recently had occasion to read a whole bunch of his speeches. And these speeches are unimaginable for a modern attorney general to give. This was not that long ago. So he's in office from 1975 to 1976. And he gives speeches that are about philosophy and the role of the individual in a society. They have, some of them have sort of vaguely spiritual and religious overtones, and they're relatively long and relatively dense and relatively divorced from the activities of the Department of Justice, at least on their surface, some of them. And one thing they require, and actually Larry Kramer, who wrote the introduction to this.
I just got his book.
So he wrote the introduction to this book of Ed Levy's speeches, and he knew him at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that he notes in the introduction is that they read just completely differently from the way a modern political figure running a department would talk. There's no immediacy to them. They require actual thought. There's a lot of thought put into them. And you say, well, one of the things that's missing is attention span, right? We just don't do long, thoughtful speeches, except in an academic setting now. And that is a function of technology. I mean, it's a function of a ever-shortening media lifespan. And I don't mean to be, shortening of the media cycle. And that is a disruption caused by technology. And our brains work differently. I read these things now and they make sense as essays. But it's unimaginable to me that the Attorney General of the United States, only my lifetime ago, I mean, this is when I was 5 and 6 years old, would get up and give these as speeches. And I don't see how you can read them and the difference between a speech by this guy and a speech by Jeff Sessions. And so we don't know about Merrick Garland because he doesn't give speeches, but or hasn't yet. But a speech by
that must be so pleasant. Like so wonderful to just be like, sorry, I don't give speeches.
I don't think he gave a single speech in his career on the bench. I don't think he ever gave any speeches.
I mean, I think that is a good point in terms of like the difference in speaking styles. But on Kate's question about tech disruption, I think if you look at the history of technology innovation, technology certainly does get normalized. And in the case of the car, we saw that. But the normalization took decades. I mean, I'm old enough to remember cars in the 1960s did not have safety belts. Like it took decades in order to introduce even basic safety features. And what I would argue in terms of our current digital technology is we're at the stage now where there's a lot of technology out there. There are all these problems. There's a techlash, kind of people are reacting against these. What we haven't done is develop new policies, laws, and regulations for this new digital era. And that's what we need to do. The problem is we don't have decades to do it. Like we have months and a few years to do it. And we know policymaking takes a long time. So my concern is the policy has not kept up with the technology, and it may not keep up with it. And we may not be able to normalize our current technologies because part of the process of normalizing it is developing policies to deal with the bad consequences of technology.
So first to Ben's point, I'm just going to say, well, Ben, I take your point, and I obviously think that there are certain elements of that. But I would here is my counterfactual to your argument, which is that it is not that people's attention spans have gotten shorter. It is that people's attention spans had always been that short, and no one was reading like Levy's writings, and he was speaking to a very small elite audience that had an attention span and like a scholarship and kind of like a training to understand and appreciate that type of writing. And that there has been a democratization and kind of leveling of like access to different types of writing and different types of ideas that actually brings a lot of scholarship and a lot of like very big policy ideas and everything else to the masses, so to speak, without trying to sound like completely.
So I think there are elements of truth to that, but it is also true that until the Iraq War protests in Italy, the largest gathering in the history of Italy was the funeral of Giuseppe Verdi. And, mass culture, like, understood Verdi, which is not something that would happen today. And so I do think there's a democratization causes but I also think we used to have higher expectations of the democratized than we do now. And we are designing technologies, and I'm not a technophobe, I'm not decrying this, I'm just observing it. That I do think we are designing technologies that push us in this direction. And if you can watch and look, I mean, we talk about this at Brookings all the time. How do we reach more people? And nobody answers. It's by writing more 30-page policy proposals. Like that's not what we're doing.
But we're still writing detailed policy reports, but we now have blogs that basically provide the Cliff Notes version. So there are many people that want the short version, but we still link to the longer reports. So there is that information out there. But I think the problem with technology is almost every technology is dual use in nature, in the sense that it can be used for good or ill purposes. And it's part of the regulatory challenge. Like, we want to maintain the benefits of the technology while dealing with the negative side effects. It's hard to do when the very same technology, like facial recognition, can be used either for mass surveillance or to find missing children.
So let's compare this to the regulatory environment in which we are in now, which is the policy environment. Like, let's just compare it to cars, because I kind of like this analogy, and it's kind of like sparking right at this moment. So you had cars, and as far as my understanding is that tort law helped basically create a more efficient system of regulation. And there are certain things that happen with cars. Cars were like terrible. They had smog. They were loud. Like people were very there's all types of essays about people being sad that cars are going away, and that horses are going away, and that cars are coming in, and what this means for city life and everything else. So they're unsafe. People get into crashes, and there's no safety restrictions that are foreseeable, that were kind of created, that were foreseeable. So we developed those over 20, 30 years, and then we institute them in regulation. But the other thing that I want to say is that people were doing things with cars that were illegal. They were, for example, being bootleggers, or transporting people across borders illegally, or doing whatever. And there wasn't a blaming of the foreseeability of that on the car manufacturers. And so there seems to be, with Section 230 and how it gives an escape from liability, for civil liability, from in defamation or anything really, with it being so broadly construed against these tech companies, that it's stopping or preventing the natural kind of evolution that happened with something like the technology of cars, where we were allowed for the courts to experiment and create new types of tests and everything else, so that eventually, once the norm settled in, we would have the regulation. To your point, though, Darrell, there's no time. There's no time for either that law to develop, and there's no time, there's definitely not any time maybe anymore, because we already blocked it from happening. So I think, does that I don't know, does that parse, Ben, or do you kind of disagree with that type of synopsis of why Section 230 kind of halted some of possibly some of the responses from policy?
I largely agree with that. I think there's many things going on here. One of them is, the effects on us, right? Another is the ability of policy to respond to it. And that I don't think has a lot of precedent. Nader had years to yell about the car industry before in the 70s the court started catching on. We don't really have that much time to yell about Facebook before the platform changes in subtle ways that make the complaints irrelevant and give rise to new complaints.
But let's be honest here that for the last 30 years, as the technologies have developed, we have basically had a libertarian stance on regulation, meaning there's been very little regulation. And this was a conscious decision of the Clinton administration in the 1990s. And Kate,
I remember theater.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you may remember after the healthcare debacle, they put Ira in charge of technology policy, and they did a study, did an analysis. Their conclusion was, let's not regulate the internet because it's new and we don't know how it's going to develop. And that might have been the right decision at that point in time, but it wasn't the right decision for the next 30 years. And this is how we've ended up in this situation where there are all these problems. There's no legal accountability because you can't really sue the large tech platforms. And all these abuses have developed with very little policy response. Now, I do believe that libertarian era has come to an end. We are entering a new era where there's going to be more public interest, public engagement, public oversight, and public regulation. But the problems are big, and it's complicated to develop the new regulations once the industry has developed in the manner that it has.
And also, every time you start, the ground changes, right? And, it used to be if the car company said, no, we can self-regulate, you don't need to, that took years between, and now, Facebook can say, we're getting rid of news in Australia, and they throw a switch and there's no news in Australia anymore,
But what if that's just but it used to take us 3 months to cross the Atlantic. Okay. And now you can jump on a plane and be in Europe. And I'm not trying to be I'm not, but these, and I also don't mean to keep making it about costs and transaction costs, but all I can think about is it just it's all of the friction is getting winnowed and winnowed and winnowed and winnowed. And we've built a society in which our laws and policies are based in part on the realities of the friction that we thought was going to be there for a long time. And it's just not. It's just disappearing. And you can throw a switch in Australia. I just think sometimes about how incredibly insane it is that we have been doing this show for almost a year, Ben, every single day. And it has cost me 1 hour of my day. 1 hour of my day, I reach a couple thousand people. We have had on an incredible array of scholars and academics and thinkers. It's been amazing. That was just not, I just think that sometimes I'm not being all bullish on technology. I'm just kind of thinking sometimes I do feel the panic is overblown and we're all just very uncomfortable. And it's just going to take a little bit of time. That's never a popular thing to say on a panel, by the way.
Well, what I hear when I'm giving talks, what people worry about in regard to technology is the loss of human agency. They think we're no longer in charge, that the technology has advanced to the point where it's just going to take on a life of its own and eventually enslave us. What I tell them is that is not the case. Humans are still in charge through the laws, the policies, and the regulations. It's just a matter of exercising that power. It's not that we don't have the power to deal with some of the problems, it's we haven't done it. But I do believe that's going to change going forward. It's going to be complicated to work it out. We see it with the privacy law, and there are so many different considerations there. There are the issues in terms of cybersecurity, there are antitrust questions, but these things are now on the agenda for the country. And if you look at some of the appointments of the new Biden administration, he's appointing some pretty tough people to high-level positions, which tells me he understands that there are problems and he wants to address them. So going forward, I think we are going to be in charge. There are going to be tougher rules and tougher enforcement actions. It is going to be a new era for technology.
Yeah. All right. Before we shift gears entirely, I want to ask about something that was alluded to earlier, which is the question of how this all affects think tanks. Because it seems to me that actually one of the things that's, that underlies Kate and Molly's dispute, Molly goes in and reads old property records and figures out cool things. So life feels pretty similar to her. Kate puts on this show every day, studies the new governors, right, and platforms where things are moving really fast and are disrupted on an ongoing basis. So they feel really different to her. How do they feel to you in your life as a manager? You now you have a large group in GS that is entirely remote. In your life as a scholar, we all have to decide now, is this a tweet? Is it a paper? Is it a book? Is it a podcast? I mean, we have a million form choices. And one of the questions I keep scratching my head about is, the Brookings Institution has 3 large buildings down below DuPont Circle in Washington. And, we seem to have functioned pretty well without them the last year. And so my question is, I don't doubt that there is a viable, good business model for think tanks, but how different is it from the model we kind of are all used to?
I mean, Brookings has basically become an almost fully digital think tank right now because we all been operating remotely. We post things on the web. We have all these communications tools to put things out. It's no longer just writing policy reports, but we have blogs, we have podcasts, you have your video streaming platform, there are tweets. We have to utilize the full range of things that are out there. And what excites me about this particular historic moment is just the opportunities to do research in different ways and to communicate in different ways. And I think we're actually doing both of them. Like with all of the information online, we have colleagues who are using web scraping techniques to kind of get at that information and undertake new types of analyses that would not have been possible in the pre-digital world. So I think it is changing our research. It opens up a lot of possibilities, and we can communicate in very different ways. And the particular way we choose depends on the nature of the audience and who is the object of what we're trying to do.
I love that question. When I was a Brown and working at the Taubman Center, I remember hearing that we had funding from a think tank, Brookings, and it's very interesting. I just didn't come from a background where I knew what that was, or that made that kind of parsed to me. And the same was true of, honestly, kind of some of the fancy new consulting companies that had started in the 80s and 90s, like the Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey and some of the others that people were starting to go to from the top universities. I'm very interested, do you have a sense that the influence has grown? Has it become broader at the cost of depth? Or do you think that there's been a nice mix of you publish the books that people can go to if they want to read a full book on something, but you also publish the cliff notes in a blog post, and that actually reaches a lot more people and gets ideas out there?
I think we try and provide, and we need to provide, both breadth and depth, because there are people and academics, or certainly in this category, that want the details. They want to know how you did the study and what the results were. There are others that basically want the headlines. They want the results of the analysis. They trust us to actually do the analysis properly and effectively, and they want to know, what are the action points? How do we change policy based on the research that you have done? So we still have to do the research. It has to be in-depth and high-quality research, but that doesn't mean we can't also communicate the headlines, because that's what policymakers want. They say there are these problems in terms of market competition, antitrust. How can we solve these issues?
David Bott, you get the first question today.
Well, thanks very much. Really interesting discussion. Darrell, interested in your thoughts about AI, and do you feel there is racism and cultural bias within AI implementations? And to the degree that you do see bias, what are your thoughts about how to mitigate and manage that?
It's a great question. The short answer is yes. There is racism in AI. The problem with AI is that the algorithms are only as good as the data on which they are based. And the data sets that almost all of us work with are either incomplete or not representative of the larger population. And a lot of the biases are coming from biased data. And so to solve the bias of AI, we have to solve the bias in data. And that is a big challenge.
So can you give an example of that? Like,
well,
I mean, it's a really striking point, and I just would love to put some meat on the bones of it.
The example that everybody cites is facial recognition, just in the sense that, if most of the images on which the facial recognition tools have been trained are Caucasian faces. And so the algorithms actually are pretty accurate at gauging the faces of Caucasians, but the faces of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, the accuracy rate can drop by 20 or 30 percentage points or more. And when you have law enforcement using it, like a 20% error rate is just completely unacceptable. We also see a lot of financial institutions using algorithms for loan processing and to make decisions on mortgages and loans. Now, the law
this is
basically
actually
says,
horrible.
Yeah, there are lots of bad applications there. And the law says you can't use gender, race, and marital status in there. There are algorithms that do not use race, gender, or marital status, but there are proxies that basically tell them the same thing. Like if you know somebody's news consumption, magazine subscriptions, if you have access to their online purchases, like you could basically predict race, gender, and marital status with a high degree of accuracy. So algorithms can incorporate prohibited factors without actually accessing that information. That creates a lot of possibilities for mischief.
Well, the one thing I want to complicate that idea with, but I completely agree with everything you've said, and I think that that's a great example. But the thing that is interesting here is that I think that there is an assumption of intent that we're used to kind of sticking on the term like racist or something like that. And I think that these can have like the effects of like being discriminatory on race, and or against but it's not like, I want to be clear, it's not like the AI is making a decision or knows it's making a decision. It is looking at what it is given, and it's it is a function of two things. One, the human data set that it is given, and the humans who decide to limit that data set or define that data set. And then the applications for which it's then decided to be used, which are all like humans in the loop. And so the AI is very much like doing something, but it's only a machine. It's only doing as much as it's directly told to do, which is to solve a problem that if it turns out that it uses racist or prohibitive kind of categories to make a determination about something, that it doesn't know that unless you tell it. And so I think that that's that's the only kind of the wrinkle. I think that is so important, because I do think that people hear about AI and talk about AI as if it is sentient in a way that is far from being.
But you see, this is a problem in terms of proving bias and discrimination lawsuits now, because typically you have to meet two conditions. One, show a disparate impact across protected groups, but then you're right, you also have to show intent. Now, with a human lending officer, you can interview the person, review the emails, interview coworkers, see if there is evidence of intent.
No, you can show one.
But with an algorithm, how do you prove intent to discriminate? That becomes a very big complicating factor.
Yeah, no, you can. No, that's a wonderful point. And I think that what I think that courts have been increasingly doing is inferring intent, because they can't find a smoking gun. They can't find the email that says I discriminated against someone because they're Black or they're a woman or they're pregnant. And so they say, well, we have this huge amount of survey data that shows us that there is discriminatory impact, so we will take that as intent, and that's as close as we can get. But that is so hard to get, and it comes so far after the harm and everything else, and so it's just not a very efficient way of doing this.
Daniel, you want to change the subject to billionaires?
So I have two.
One of my favorite topics.
I have two questions. One is, what is your favorite billionaire story? And the second is, how do you think the political outlook of billionaires will change or has changed after the Capitol riot?
Great question.
Both those are great questions. I don't see a lot of impact of the events of January 6th on billionaires. People who have money have even more money over the last year based on the pandemic. And so, public policy for the last 30 years has been tilted very heavily in favor of corporations as well as the wealthy. And the wealthy now are able to translate economic power into political power, the dark money operations, direct contributions to candidates, parties, and causes. So it creates a built-in problem. And Kate mentioned the issue of accountability earlier. It's like, it's hard to have accountability in a democracy when there is a small group of people with a lot of money who can use that money to influence the political process. So I don't see anything recently that has happened that has changed that. Even Biden, who wants to raise income taxes on the wealthy, that is not going to dent income inequality in America, because wealth is the source of the inequality. It's actually not income.
So what's your favorite billionaire story?
Oh, I want to hear this
from reporting your book.
I have many favorite billionaire stories, not all of which I will attribute to a particular billionaire, but I do recall one billionaire who I knew very well, that we were talking about this issue of raising taxes on the wealthy. And of course, rich people hate that idea. They think it's completely unfair. And in one of these conversations, the spouse of one of these billionaires said, "I don't understand why people are angry with us. We have parties. That means we hire people." And so that was the justification on why they should not see their taxes go up, which I thought indicated exactly why we needed to raise taxes on them.
I love that. I love that sort of degree of self-awareness and
Yes.
just sort of understanding of one's place in the world. Susan
Oh my
Brewer,
God, that was really good.
the floor is yours. It's a real Marie Antoinette kind of
It truly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Susan, oh, there you are. I was having trouble bringing you on screen.
Hey. Okay. Hi, how are you, Kate? Ben, thanks for bringing me on. So Darrell, the title of your new book is Divided Politics and Divided Nation. And so that suggests that you've given the subject considerable time studying it. What is it that you know that would allow the public to grasp these differences better for those of us who haven't yet read your book?
Well, I have studied the topic of political polarization, but I also have lived it. What is distinctive about that book is it traces kind of the 40-year history from 1980 to 2020, so basically from Reagan to Trump, in terms of how we became such a polarized nation. But I also have lived it because I come from a divided family. So I grew up in rural Ohio, grew up on a dairy farm, very conservative area. My two sisters still live there. They're Christian fundamentalists. They love Donald Trump. My brother is liberal and gay, and he hates Donald Trump. So you can only imagine how our family reunions go. So for me, it has been both a personal as well as a professional thing. On the topic of how we get out of this mess, I'm actually semi-optimistic in the sense that if you look historically, this is not the first time America's been divided. The 1790s had very high polarization. The 1890s was a very polarized time. And then the 1990s, and basically since then, has been very polarized. But typically, polarization at a very high level is not sustainable because it basically paralyzes government. And eventually something comes along that demands action. And so somehow we have to get over the polarization. Sometimes it's a war that unifies the country and then therefore provokes action. In the 1930s, it was the Great Depression. It was such a climactic event that we had to come together and address things. So I just think we're now kind of at 30 years into this current era of polarization. Something will happen to break that. The 2020 election could be the start of that. If that turns out not to be the case, I would predict the 2024 or the 2028 election will be the case, because demographic change is advancing in America to the point that by 2045, if you add up African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, they will be a majority in America. And so 10 years from now, our politics are going to be completely different. I like to tell people, a lot of people are just trapped in the status quo and think whatever the status quo is now, it's going to be the same 5 years and 10 years from now. If you just look at demographic change, American politics clearly is going to be very different in the not very distant future. So the things that polarize us now may fade in oblivion, in the same way that 100 years ago, we had wild debates over the gold standard, and then basically we solved that issue and nobody really gives a damn about that.
Could we bring back the gold standard to debate? I would so prefer that to everything else.
You prefer that to Dr. Seuss and
oh geez. Also, Darrell,
and Mr. Potato Head?
Yeah, I know, definitely. But I was going to say, Darrell, I didn't know that was your background, and I have my parents are definitely white collar, but they came from blue collar backgrounds, and I have a similarly completely split politically family from a very agrarian kind of factory working kind of types, and then others, and it's just there the two shall meet. And I think it's actually maybe was ultimately a blessing to grow up with everything that's been going on.
My Facebook page is very wild, because basically I have the ultra liberal students from Brown University who Kate will
we're liberal,
and then my ultra conservative and very pro-Trump friends from high school who now are on Facebook. And next year I have my 50th high school reunion, and that is going to be a wild event.
Well, the only big political split in my family is my father's family were Truman voters, and my mother's family were Henry Wallace voters in 1948. That's the big divide. And if you go back in American Jewish families long enough, that's where the line is drawn. If the floor is yours.
Hi, Ed. Thanks. Hi. So maybe we could go back to AI and biases. I was wondering, should we make particular laws for AI, or be more tech neutral and try to apply existing principles? So would current laws be sufficient, or?
I don't think the laws necessarily have to be limited to AI, because you're right. Some of these questions, and certainly the issue of bias, goes way beyond AI to a wide range of digital practices and digital platforms. I mean, what I actually want is to be able to transfer many of our existing laws from the bricks and mortar world into the digital world. So we have a lot of anti-bias and anti-discrimination laws. But the problem is, when you start to translate them, the digital world is different enough that it's not a one-to-one transition. There are complications that means that when you're applying anti-bias laws to the digital world, that question of intent, how do you prove intent with an algorithm? It's easy with a human lending officer, it's hard with an algorithm. So those are the types of complications we need to figure out. But you're right, it should not be tech specific. It's kind of figuring out what is the problem as it relates to the digital world in general.
Right. Oz Galarza, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions. The first question is, given the prime age in the workforce today, what is your stand on universal basic income? That's something that's been discussed lately at the political level. And in terms of education, do you anticipate any changes in the K-12 and K-20 sector as a result of the forced infuse of technology that's happened in the last year? Because I'm seeing some pushback against it. So thank you for taking my question.
Well, I was a lot more optimistic about online learning until we actually had to start doing it across the board over the last year, because it's clear that it has not worked well for many students and in many cases. So we do have to figure out how to try and take advantage of the technology to broaden access to information and diversify the kinds of information people have. But as a pedagogic device, clearly, I think human instruction has is still the better way to proceed, and it's going to be a hybrid model, I think, going forward. On the UBI question, that's an interesting question because prior to 2 months ago, the way I would have answered that is we need to start having pilot projects on UBI at the local level just to see how it works. Like, we should start providing cash in a few communities, followed up by serious evaluation to figure out, does it improve one's sense of security? Does it help people meet their needs better? Stockton, California actually has been doing this, and we're starting to see some analysis coming out of that. But with the new $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, there is a version of UBI in the child tax credit that was included there, because as opposed to it being a tax credit, there are low-income individuals who are going to start to get a monthly income payment from the federal government. That is actually a great basis for an experiment to see how does that affect people. So I hope that there are academics and other researchers out there that are starting to think about experiments on this policy that is going into effect to see how does it affect people. Does it actually improve their sense of security? Because that then can inform future policymaking.
Oh, you're muted, Ben. Hi,
Oops.
Michael.
Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Daryl, great discussion, as always.
And Mike, congratulations on your wedding. I know you just got married over the weekend. So
thank you. A Zoom wedding.
Congratulations.
10 time zones. Half of my question, actually 80% of my question, was asked by Eve. So I'll ask an expanded question. A couple hours ago, you and General Allen posted something on the need for global treaties on artificial intelligence. The National Security Commission on AI just came out with its final report, and they made the point that it doesn't really make sense to draw a line and say this is artificial intelligence and we'll regulate it. They went much broader and said we've got to think about it, emerging technologies, big data. I mean, there's a whole cluster of issues. So my question is, first, what do you think of this new report from the National Security Commission and on AI, and how would you actually define what do you regulate and what do you write a treaty about when we don't have a definition for artificial intelligence?
I mean, I think it's in general a good report with a lot of thoughtful recommendations in it. In general, the way I am thinking about AI regulation as well as tech regulation in general is the European Union has developed a new model which they call a risk-adjusted approach to regulation, where the degree of regulation depends entirely on the kind of risk. So with AI, it's how many consumers are affected by a particular algorithm and what is the kind of impact. Like, is it like a minor annoyance to people, or is it a threat to your civil liberties and your human safety? Like, the case of autonomous vehicles. And so therefore, the algorithms that affect a lot of people and have a direct effect on people's lives or their freedoms, that warrants considerable regulation. But there are a lot of algorithms out there that don't rise to that scale or don't pose that kind of threat that actually shouldn't be regulated. So there, I actually would be libertarian. And on the post that John Allen and I just wrote for the Brookings Tech Tank blog, it was entitled, "It's Time to Have Global Agreements and Global Treaties on AI." And the point that we make there is, right after World War II, there are all these new technologies of nuclear bombs, chemical weapons, biochemical agents, and so on. The world basically came together and negotiated a bunch of agreements to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, to prohibit the use of chemical weapons, which by and large is held, with the exception of a few cases in Syria and in Iraq. We basically negotiated with our major adversary, the Soviet Union, and imposed some limits on warfare. So John and I argue that now, in regard to AI and other emerging technologies, we need to start talking to the Russians, the Chinese, and other foreign governments to come up with some guardrails on the use of AI in warfare. So John obviously is a retired general, has tremendous expertise in defense and military issues. And so he wants there to be guardrails in which there are certain things where we will use AI for purposes of defense and national security, but other ways which we will basically say we will not do that. Like he wants to keep humans in the loop on the use of autonomous weapon systems, like drones, for example. But, we need to negotiate these things because right now, there actually are no limits on the use of AI for warfare. There's the very real risk. We could end up in a war because of a technology accident. There could be some autonomous drone that attacks a U.S. naval warship, off the shores of China, and provokes a series of conflicts. So we need to be talking to our adversaries now to kind of figure out where we're going to use AI, where we're not going to use it, in the same way that we did it in the post-World War II period.
I just really quickly before I go to Tony, I know we're running out of time, but are you familiar with Rebecca Krutoff? She's at Richmond Law School. She has published extensively on autonomous weapon systems, and she does a ton of really great work on this. I would love to connect you with her. She's written, she's great on this. And the other thing that I was going to ask you is, I have always understood that the difference between autonomous weapon systems as a regulatory mechanism, like to regulate autonomous weapon systems versus to regulate nuclear capabilities, there's like a limit on the type. You can limit, like it's hard to get plutonium, like it's actually difficult. Whereas like it is very easy to get a tiny little circuit board, and to build all the parts of a drone and to pack it full of dynamite and fly it over like Palestine or something. And so
that is exactly right. And also, there are big complications in the AI world in terms of inspections. Like, you can go to another country and find plutonium because it's radioactive. How do you regulate the use of AI internationally in national defense? How do you prove the Chinese or the Russians aren't using it in ways that we would not support?
Right.
Tony Cava, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you. I apologize. We're doing some office remodeling here, so I'm keeping Una out of the shot, moving the thing around. So I've heard we've used the term "we" a lot today, and I'm wondering if we kind of could spend a little bit of time discussing who that "we" is, because it strikes me that there are a lot of people who are, and you struck on it when you were talking about how distance learning has fallen short the past year and a half. And so I was wondering if we could talk about, should we be doing things like moving towards distance learning or moving towards e-government when such a large swath of our population is basically shut out of, people don't have Wi-Fi, people don't have access to computers, et cetera.
That's a very important point. Fully support that. There are 20% of Americans that basically don't have home access to broadband, and a larger number doesn't have access to high-speed broadband, which you need to take advantage of distance learning, telemedicine, and other applications. So the one optimism about the possibility of bipartisanship actually is rural broadband. There is a bipartisan coalition that supports that. So I'm hopeful that between the legislation that already is passed and a future infrastructure bill, that we will make big progress on closing that gap.
Connor Norton, you get the last question today, except that you're muted.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay. So there's on the media, a WNYC radio show, they always, every year on tax time, they talk about how Intuit basically has made it very difficult to file your taxes. And so just to keep themselves in business, to what extent are tech companies forestalling, the government's, own efficiency by just kind of, doing things like that?
That is absolutely the case. There are a lot of countries where you can go to their equivalent of the IRS and directly file your taxes online. In America, we actually had this debate. It was a little more than 15 years ago, where there were people who actually wanted to move to direct online government filing, and they basically were stopped by the private lobbyists, the companies that do tax preparation. And we haven't recovered from that. We have not changed that policy. And so we still cannot file directly via the IRS. We have to go through third-party commercial sites. And there's no reason to do that. Like, with, many other government services, you renew your driver's license, you go to the DMV. You don't go to some private company that then will help you renew your license. There's no need for an intermediary there.
We are going to leave it there. Daryl West, you're a great American, a great director of governance studies at Brookings. And I actually say you're a great American to every guest. It's not simply flatter the boss.
Don't tell him that, Ben.
Well, that's what I tell Brown University students. They're all well above average. Too.
Yes, exactly.
Which is actually accurate too.
We will be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 59 minutes from now, with May El Sadani, who asked that we move her to Thursday rather than Friday. Maybe asked that we move her to Friday rather than Thursday.
She was on Thursday, but tomorrow.
Yeah, sorry. We don't know who's going to be on the show tomorrow. We'll figure that out sometime in the next 22 hours and 58 minutes from now. Until then, we don't have fun anymore, but we have lots of highly intelligent data sets that are not yet sentient, but make important judgments about us without discriminatory intent, but with discriminatory access to data and with discriminatory, probably subconsciously programmers.
That was good, Ben.
It was long. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you, Darrell.
So nice to hang out with you.
Thank you.